dinosaur, and we've talked about this S-shaped big picture for growth. Right, so we have sharp growth spurt from 0 to 2, very sharp 0 to 1. It does tail off a little bit 1 to 2, but not a lot. And then from 2, we continue obviously to see growth, but it's much less dramatic. And then we go into puberty, we have another very dramatic growth spurt. So we can't put a time on this because it depends upon the individual, right? Some kids are going to go into puberty early, be early maturers, some are going to be late maturers, so this could be anywhere from 10 to 15 or so for a girl, and from 11, 12 to 16, 17 for a boy. Right? So the range of the start of puberty can be pretty broad. If you're going to work with that age group, that can have quite a big impact in PD. And then we're going to hopefully flatline, right? And you'll see in a minute that that will depend a little bit. If I'm looking at height, then on average, babies around 20 inches or so, right? By year 1, they're 30 inches, so they grew half as much, again, in 1 year. So imagine your height now, and in a year's time, you were half your height bigger. Right? It's a massive, massive amount of growth going on. And so for their brain, that's a lot of learning. How do I control all this change that's happening? Right? We think about our center of gravity. It's constantly moving around. Right? So it's very difficult for the brain to start to organize things when there's that much change going on. If I look at weight, on average, 7.5 pounds at birth, about 22 pounds by year 1, so 3 times as much weight that the brain's trying to deal with. So lots and lots of change. It's really tricky when you're looking at brain development to try to work out how hard that is for the brain to learn to move when the body is changing that dramatically. So if we look at height first, peak height velocity for girls somewhere between 11 and 12. So that's not the tallest, we're looking at velocity. Right? So on a velocity curve, the point of time at which they're growing the fastest, other than that first 2 years, is between 11 and 12 on average for girls. And for most girls, then the speed in height change is going to start tapering off around 14. So they might grow some more, but it's going to be a lot more slow. It won't be as a dramatic change as it was between 11 and 12. And finish growing around 16. Not everybody, it's an average picture. Okay, so you probably know someone that was still growing and got taller at 17. So there are individuals that break the mold, but the general picture. Okay. For boys, their peak height velocity is somewhere between 13 to 14 on average. So the point at which they're growing the fastest. And remember, we said that boys grow more, right? Most boys are taller than most girls. Okay. So the change in height that's going on this year is a lot more dramatic for a boy than it would be for a girl. Right? and they're going to finish growing somewhere around 17, 18. Again, not everybody. My brother was still growing when he finished college at 21, I think. He still grew another inch or so. So what we have is a situation where the guys get to grow for longer. It's not that genetically bones in males are different to bones in females, right? Genetically they're the same, it's just that guys get to grow for a longer period of time than girls do. So therefore their bones end up longer and they end up taller. How many of you have done AMP already? Okay, so in AMP, hopefully you will have learned about epiphyseal plates, right, on a long bone. So I'm very bad at drawing long bones, but a long bone kind of does that. And we have our growth plate, our epiphyseal plates here, right? When we looked at the fetus on Friday, we said that the bone grew from those central areas, right? But once we're born, if it's a long bone, the only way long bones grow once we're born is from this epiphyseal plate. So we lay down extra cells and the bone gets longer. Right? In everyday language, we call the epiphyseal plate the growth plate. And you can get some quite dramatic injuries if you damage the growth plate. Right? So one of the things that we want to be aware of is taking care of children who are not finished with puberty, because if we damage that growth plate, that can impact how long that bone can grow. Right? So high trauma activities generally aren't a good plan with kids who are pre-pubertal. Well, that's great, except in my sport, in gymnastics, we do a lot of high impact work before they've gone through puberty. So there are some sports that we're not very behind here. What happens when I go into puberty, the reason we see this growth and then a flat line when we're talking about height is that when we go into puberty, we're not at sexual maturity yet. Right? So part of puberty is becoming sexually mature, which means we starting to release a lot of testosterone, a lot of estrogen. And those hormones, as they build up in the body, are responsible for closing the epiphyseal plate. So once I start puberty and I start releasing testosterone or estrogen, I'm going to stop growing reasonably soon, right? Because they're responsible for just turning off the epiphyseal plate, and that's it, that bone can't grow anymore. So the velocity curve looks like this. Okay. So you see peak height velocity for girls is earlier than it is for boys. And on a velocity curve, going up means we're growing fast. Going down means we're growing more slowly, not that we're not growing. Right? It's just, this is, the hump is the peak. That's the fastest change in height. And after that point, I'm still getting taller, but it's not as quick. Does that make sense? So you just have to be a little bit careful when you read a velocity graph. It's saying the same as this, but you've just got to pay attention to coming down doesn't mean that I'm not growing. So boys end up generally quite a bit taller than girls, on the whole. Not for the girls that play Olympic volleyball, because they're giants. Not for Maria Sharapova, because she's, what, 6'2" or something, so not typical at all. Weight is a little bit different, right? In theory, it follows that same idea of the S-curve, and with height, especially in this country, in a Western healthy country, we don't see very much change from an S-curve when we're looking at a child's height. Right? It takes a lot to knock a child off their genetic height pattern. Can, but it's unusual in this country. Right? They get enough food, they get enough play, they get enough stimulation, they get enough milk. We don't see very much impact on a height curve. A weight curve is much more susceptible to what is going on from the outside. So there's a genetic pattern. A weight curve should follow an S, but it's got a lot more going on that can impact what's happening. Right? It's difficult to make your bones grow faster or slower. They'll grow as they grow. But weight, putting on muscle mass or putting on fat mass, is highly susceptible to what's going on within that person's life. So, kids, when they go into puberty, grow up and then fill out. So again, when I look at weight, right, I see a big change from my 7.5 pound baby to my probably 35, 40 pound 2-year-old, right? That's a big change in weight. Then we plod along 4 pounds, so maybe 5 pounds a year, and then all of a sudden we go into puberty. Anybody vaguely remember how much weight they put on the first year they were in puberty? I can't think, probably about 10 pounds. Right? So I know I put on a lot that first year. Right? So we see a very similar thing, and if we are good parents and if we provide lots of physical activity and good nutrition, then I should be seeing this 4 to 5 pounds as they get a bit taller every year. They should put on a little bit of weight every year. I shouldn't be seeing a kid put on 10 pounds in a year. Once we go into puberty, everything goes a bit berserk. Right? All of a sudden I get taller, and then all of a sudden I start filling out. Generally, the taller happens first, and then the fill out. Okay? So, we grow up, then we fill out. Peak weight velocity then, the point in time when I'm putting weight on the fastest, is after my peak height velocity. Right? So for girls, that's somewhere around 3 to 11 months later. So they get taller, and then it can be almost a year before they seem to put on a lot of weight. Right? So it's a little, you can get a little bit blasé about the girls because they get taller and they just get these nice long legs and they don't get fat and they don't, you know, and there's no problem, and so they're going to be nice. And then all of a sudden, about 10 months later, right, start getting spots and chubby and all that stuff going on. Right? Guys, it's a little bit different. Guys, when they go through puberty, don't put on a lot of fat mass. They put on some fat mass, but they put on more muscle mass because the hormone they release is testosterone, and that stimulates laying down muscle. So they do their very, very fast height thing, and the change in height is dramatic. And then about 2 to 5 or 6 months so later, they start to fill out. And they start to put on some muscle mass onto the skeleton. That muscle mass takes a little while to get strong, so what we see is it takes them about a year to get strong enough to deal with the sudden change in height. So we tend to quite often think of teenage boys as being quite clumsy, because they grow this massive skeleton, and that skeleton is heavy, bone is heavy, and they don't put the muscle on to move all this bone around. And so things they could do quite well, they may lose a little bit, but they also do things like reach for a glass of water and knock it over, right? Because their brain has this movement pattern based on an arm that weighed this and was this big, and now the arm is bigger, but it weighs more and it changes the path, right, of how I move the arm with gravity pulling on it. Because if it weighs more, gravity is exerting that force. My mass is larger, so my inertia is larger, so moving the arm is harder, right? So it can be quite frustrating for teenage boys, especially if they're into sport and moving. Like, I could do this, I was really good at this, and now I can not do it properly anymore. So you've got to be prepared if you're going to work with that age group in PE or in sport. How are you going to motivate them during this time? How are you going to make sure they understand that they can come out the other side and everything will be not that bad? So a distance curve, like my S curve, gives me the extent of the growth. Because here would be time, and here would be growth in height or growth in weight. A velocity curve shows me the rate of growth. At any one time, how fast is someone growing. So if your parents or your grandparents measured you on your birthday every year, right? Or if your grandparents measured your parents, and you can go into your grandparents' house and see the little notches on the wall, right? Then you'll see notches that are relatively consistent, and then all of a sudden there's a big jump, right? Because all of a sudden we get that second growth spurt. So if we look at the body as a whole, we see this kind of S, but you've got to remember that different body parts, different tissues, different organs do their own growth. Like my heart doesn't grow at the same time as my stomach, doesn't grow at the same time as my skeleton, right? So just because I look taller doesn't mean that every system is mature. And one of the weird things that happens when you look at growth over time is we see the proportions change quite dramatically. So on page 66 in your textbook, there's a really nice diagram that gives you an idea of proportion. So when you're a baby, a large amount of your length is your head, and a very little amount of your length is your legs. But when you're an adult, a very little amount of your length is your head, and quite a lot, depending on how lucky you were with your genetics, right? Quite a lot of your length is due to your legs. So proportionally, we change by a large amount, and that can impact what we see from a motor development perspective. What we see infants and toddlers do with this great big head is different to what we see an adult do because they've got a small head and relatively big base of support. If I've got itty bitty feet, my base of support, what do I have to do to my base of support to stay on balance? Widen, right? Which are where I'm going to go. The bigger my base of support, the more stable I am, the harder it is to knock me off balance. So, when I'm young, and I've got that great big head, and I've got itty bitty tiny little feet, my base of support is very small, and I'm very, very top heavy. Right? When I'm an adult, and I've got size 10 feet, and small heads brimming with brain cells, right? But it's little, it's very easy, relatively, to stay on balance. So we see different movement behaviors from an adult, partly because of the biomechanics that are involved between a small child and an adult. Right? It's not just one thing. It's not just to do with them getting older and to do with their skeleton maturing and getting stronger. It's also to do with the mechanics of the skill. Right? So, what happens after we do the height spurt, right? After the height spurt for the boys, we start to see an increase in shoulder width. So that's called a biacromial growth spurt. Those two lumps on the outsides of your shoulders on the top there are the acromion processes. And so I have growth spurt between the acromion processes. So their shoulders get wider. So what we see from a guy is we start to get this shape. Okay? And when the bone grows, the muscle is attached to the bone with a tendon, and so when the bone grows, it tugs on the tendon, and that stimulates the muscle to grow as well. So some children get growing pains, okay? Particularly if they go through a very fast growth spurt. A lot of kids get it in their knees, and it can lead to Osgood-Schlatters, but they get like arms ache and things ache because the bone grows before the muscle responds to the growth in the bone. So at some point, the muscle's getting yanked around a little bit for a while. Okay. So the guys are going to grow tall, then their shoulders are going to start to broaden, and then they're going to lay down muscle onto that frame. The girls do their growth in height, not as dramatic as the guys typically, and then they don't do a biacromial increase, they do a growth spurt between the iliac crest, so in their hips. So their growth spurt is here, because they're supposed to get a baby in there, so it needs to be a little bit bigger, right? So what girls do is they do this. Okay. Height, hips, little bit of muscle, quite a lot of fat cells. Can't get away from it, right? That's the reality, that's the genetics. We're going to be putting down fat cells, and we put quite a lot of them down around hips, thighs, butt. Right? Mechanically then, my center of gravity for the guys goes up a little bit, and my center of gravity for girls drops a little bit. Means girls are typically a little bit better at balance skills than boys are. Because the lower my center of gravity is to the floor, the more stable I am. So on the whole, girls tend to be slightly better at skills that involve balance. What kinds of skills are the guys going to be getting better at then? They've got this wider shoulder frame, and they've got most of their muscle mass going on up here. What does that make them good at? Upper body strength. So what skills? Push-ups, bench press. What about throwing? Right? So, until they go into puberty, boys and girls are very, very similar. They're about the same height, they weigh about the same, they have about the same muscle mass. And so if you are a PE teacher in an elementary school, you can mix the boys and the girls together and you don't have to really pay any attention to that whatsoever, from a skill perspective. But if you are going to teach kids who are going through puberty or who are through puberty, now you've got some very dramatic mechanical differences. So, if I am going to do throwing in my class, I have to set it up so that the girls can be successful as well as the boys. Otherwise, why would the girls throw? The boys are going to out-throw the girl every time, unless the girl is exceptional. Right? Because they're stronger than the girl is now. Right? Doesn't matter how strong she is, they're going to be stronger unless they don't do any training at all. So, I can't compete now. I can't have everybody in the class throw at the target. I've got to have different targets. I've got to have different choices of balls. I've got to have different goals for the skill based upon the girls and the boys. Or am I going to argue girls and boys shouldn't have PE together anymore once they're post-puberty? That's a philosophical argument. I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. I know what I think, but you may or may not be in a school system that agrees with that idea. You may not have to worry about it because they may divide the girls and the boys up anyway for you. Or you may get all of them in one class. Now what do you do? So you've got to, these are structural constraints. As constraints theory says, if I change a constraint, I'm going to change the behavior that I observe given that new constraint. So I'm going to start to see things happen very differently between the boys and the girls if I'm teaching this age group. Alright, so obviously we're growing in size up to a point, we're growing in maturity. If I look at my weight curve and I'm a healthy child, I'm going to take a healthy individual because it's more straightforward, then I'm going to see something quite similar on the weight. What happens when I reach adulthood on my weight? It should. There's no reason once I'm an adult for that not to flatline. For most of us, it goes, and if we're lucky, we might get it down, and then it goes up, and then it comes down, and it goes up, and then, right? If we could make it flatline, we'd all be healthier. Right? But that's not the typical picture in Western culture. Generally, people put on a little bit of weight every year once they're an adult. In ex-phys, we talk about that quite a lot. Okay, so when you do ex-phys, we'll come back and talk about that idea, because it's not genetic, it's lifestyle. What do I do? What do I eat? What choices do I make? So, maturation rate and growth aren't necessarily the same thing. And it's difficult for us as teachers from the outside to work out how mature someone is just from their age. And in our school system, we divide children up by their age, right? Chronological age dictates when you go to school and which class of, which cohort you are with, okay? But your chronological age doesn't mean that everybody in that class is at the same maturation rate. It's easy for us to see that from sexual system maturation point of view, right? I can have girls in a class who've already got boobs, and I've got girls in the same class who haven't even started growing boobs yet, if I'm working with that age group. I'm going to have guys in the class who are already tall and starting to triangle, and I'm going to have other guys in the class who are still short and straight. Right? It's easy for us to see that, but what's going on with their heart, or their lungs, or their endocrine system? Right? All of those systems mature at different rates. So I can't make an assumption until I'm working with adults. And then once you're working with adults, if you've got a typically developing group of adults, everybody's systems are mature. Okay? So the earlier I go into puberty, then the sooner I'm going to get boobs and hips, or tall and triangle, or right? Those things can be an advantage in PE and sport. So, if the guy wants to be a good football player, the chap who goes into puberty early and is taller than everybody else in the class and stronger than everybody else in the class has a big advantage for being a football player until everybody else catches up. Right? If the girl wants to be basketball player and she goes into puberty early and she's tall and she's stronger, she might be a little bit heavier but she's going to be taller and strong, that's an advantage. If she wants to be a gymnast, it's a disadvantage, because the people who are very successful in gymnastics and ice skating tend to be the girls in particular, who go into puberty late. Because they're smaller and they're shorter and they're narrower. So it depends on what your game is as to whether being an early maturer or a late maturer is beneficial for you. But just remember, if you're going to work with that age group, you've got to pay attention to the fact that no one's the same maturity rate just because chronologically they're the same. So we want to be careful then. If I'm writing school reports, if I have to have parent meetings, right, or if I'm running out-of-school activity or a weekend activity, what am I going to tell the parents about the child who's really great at the age of 11 or 12? Does that mean they're still going to be outstanding compared to everybody in the class by the time they're 15? Right? Because you don't know what everybody else's catch-up growth is going to be. they may be 1.5 foot taller than anybody else in the class at 12, doesn't mean they're going to be 1.5 foot taller than everybody else by the time everyone is 15. Now, if they're in a sport where being 1.5 foot is beneficial, that can still give them a bit of an edge because they get that extra 2 years worth of higher skill level. But it doesn't mean that they're going to be the superstar because you don't know what everybody else is going to do when they catch up. So you've got to be a little bit careful. Parents are very, very, very pushy. Very pushy. Even the nice ones can be very pushy. Their child is a star. Their child is going to play in the NFL. Their child is going to get an Olympic gold medal. Doesn't matter if the kid can't walk across the room without tripping over its own feet. Their child is going to win. But that's a good thing. That's what parents are supposed to be. All right? They should be supportive of what their kids want to do. But there's a difference between being supportive and being pushy. There's a difference between being supportive and being realistic. I've got to understand the realistic picture versus the dream, because they're not always the same thing, no matter what anybody tells you. You don't get to do whatever you want to do if you just work hard enough. That's not true, not in our field. I can't be an Olympic basketball player, can I? Can I? Why? I work really, really hard. Why can't I be an Olympic basketball player? Because I'm 5'2". Right? Doesn't matter how hard I work. If that's the dream, it's not going to happen. So you've got to be a bit careful with mum and dad sometimes. So, during periods of rapid growth, you want to be careful. Right? If you are paying attention to what someone is doing, then you can do something appropriate in your gym class. Right? If someone is growing very, very rapidly, that is not the time to put them into a heavy weight training program. Right? If someone is only 10, maybe they should not be running a marathon. I know there are 10-year-olds running a marathon, but that is probably not developmentally or physiologically appropriate. Right? I can catch up. So if I get sick, or if I break a bone, and I'm out of action for a prolonged period of time, doesn't mean I'm not going to catch up. Okay? For most children, they'll come back to their typical curve given time after the injury or the illness. Right? So external influences might delay my curve a little bit, but it doesn't mean I won't catch up and get back to where I should have been. Again, it has to be pretty dramatic to put someone off their normal curve permanently. And there's, when you're reading, while you're studying, be thinking about, okay, what does this mean? Okay, because you can't memorize it. Don't memorize for your exam. Memorizing does not pass exams. Learning passes exams. You've got to understand what the material is trying to tell you, so that you can think it through for yourself. Because memorizing means you're going to forget, and then you won't be able to answer the question. So once I'm an adult, then we said our height curve basically flatlines. Right? When I'm 30, I don't grow an inch. And I'm taller than I was, sadly. I wish there was a way we could do that, but we can't, right? So my height basically flatlines once I've been through puberty. When we get to our mid-40s 40s or 50s, we start to decrease in height a little bit. And the older you get, the smaller you kind of shrink. If you watch your grandparents, I remember my nan. My nan was never a big woman, but she just like got shorter and shorter, and then before she died, it was like, hi there. She just kind of shrank. Partly that happens because we get a little bit sloppy with our posture, but it also happens because the discs between the bones in your spine get compressed. So what you'll find as you get older is you're a little bit taller in the morning when you get out of bed and everything's had a chance to relax. And by the evening, your pants are dragging on the floor because you kind of compress down a little bit during the day. Okay. And hopefully you won't develop osteoporosis. You want to work very hard at not developing osteoporosis because that can put you at big risk for fracture. But we can see some bone mineral disorders that also cause people to lose some height. And we said that the weight curve was highly unstable. It shouldn't be highly unstable. There's no genetic reason, there's no physiological reason other than I'm not doing what I should be doing and I'm not paying attention to it. Okay. So the average adult puts weight on during the 20s. Right? If they go to college and they're 18 or 19, then we all talk about the weight that we put on the first year in college because we leave home and we've got to feed ourselves, and we either feed ourselves too much food or we buy the wrong kinds of food, and mum's not in charge anymore. Okay. We also start to lose muscle mass. Again, we don't physiologically need to start losing muscle mass until we're in our 50s. But a lot of people in their 20s take office jobs. You guys are going to have an advantage here. Okay? If you are in a job where you have to be active, you've got a much better chance of avoiding this picture. If you eat healthily and you move every day, then there is no need to put on weight. If I eat, an apple is about 70 calories, right? Average sized apple is about 70 calories. If I eat one apple too much a day for a whole year, more than I exercise, that is almost 10 pounds. Just an apple. Okay. So you've got to be careful here. What are the extrinsic factors that might play a role in my variability? Right? Why might I not do a very good job of controlling my weight?
On the flip side, you can also have a lot of muscle gain.
You could put on some muscle mass. What would you have to do to put on muscle mass? Work out. So in this day where you have to get up at 5 and get your kids ready for school and pack their lunch and get them to the school bus and then go to work, and then it's a half-hour drive to get to the gym, and you're only allowed a 45-minute lunch, and then after work you have to get home and make sure that your kids do their homework, where do you go to the gym? Right? So, a lot of things outside what you think you're going to do. I work in a building with a gym, and I think I'm going to go to the gym twice a week. Hardly ever happens. And I work right here, and I still don't do it, right? Because we've got to teach you guys, and then you want your papers graded, or you've got questions about something, or there's advising to do, or there's another meeting across campus to go to, right? What if you're in a really, really good office job, right? You work in a bank, or you work at a really fancy gym, and they're trying to gain a new business client because then they can make the business pay some money and they can offer free amenities to people that work for that business. And you've got to take people out to lunch and out to dinner, and right? It's difficult to keep this under control with all these other issues going on. So it becomes much less predictable when we're looking at weight. If I am 21 and I weigh X, I should weigh X when I'm 41. And if I put on weight, it should be muscle mass or bone mass. But typically that is not what happens. All right, we've got just a little tiny bit more we'll finish on Wednesday, and then we will start chapter 5 on Wednesday. The notes are up. I did get that done this weekend at least.